The sun was just coming up over the city when Detective Marcus Williams pulled into the courthouse parking lot. He checked his watch and saw it was 7:30 in the morning. The trial would not start until 9, but Marcus always liked to arrive early. Today was going to be a big day. He was the main witness in a case about police corruption that had shocked the whole city. Marcus got out of his car and straightened his tie. He had been a police detective for 15 years, and he had never seen anything like this case. 3 police officers had been caught taking money from drug dealers. They had been letting criminals go free in exchange for cash. Marcus had been the one to find out about it, and now he had to tell the court what he knew. As he walked toward the courthouse, Marcus thought about how nervous he felt. He was not afraid to speak the truth, but he knew that some of his fellow officers were angry with him. They thought he should have kept quiet. But Marcus believed that bad cops made all cops look bad. The only way to fix the problem was to bring it out into the open. Meanwhile, on the other side of town, Officer Brad Thompson was getting ready for his shift. Brad had been a police officer for 12 years, but he was not like Marcus. Brad had a bad attitude toward many people, especially black people. He had received several complaints over the years, but his supervisors had always protected him. Brad looked at himself in the mirror and smiled. Today he was going to work security at the courthouse. He liked courthouse duty because it made him feel important. He got to boss people around and make sure they knew who was in charge. Brad believed that some people needed to be put in their place, and he was happy to be the one to do it. At the same time, Chief Judge David Washington was in his home office, reading through case files. Judge Washington was 55 years old and had been a judge for 20 years. He was known throughout the city as a fair and honest man. He treated everyone the same, no matter what color their skin was or how much money they had. Judge Washington was getting ready for what he knew would be a difficult day. The corruption case was going to bring a lot of attention to his courtroom. Reporters would be there, and the families of the accused officers would be watching. He needed to make sure everything went perfectly. The judge was a tall, dignified man who always dressed well. But today he decided to wear casual clothes to the courthouse. He wanted to review some files in his office before changing into his judge robes. He put on a simple shirt and pants, picked up his briefcase, and headed out the door. Back at the courthouse, the building was starting to fill up with people. Lawyers were arriving with their briefcases and files. Court reporters were setting up their equipment. Security guards were checking their metal detectors and preparing for a busy day. The courthouse was an old building with marble floors and high ceilings. It had been built 50 years ago when the city was much smaller. Now it felt crowded and busy. People rushed through the halls, their footsteps echoing off the walls. Marcus Williams walked through the main entrance and showed his badge to the security guard. The guard waved him through without any problems. Marcus had been to this courthouse many times before, and everyone knew he was a police officer. He found a quiet corner in the lobby and sat down to review his notes one more time. He wanted to make sure he remembered all the important details. The case was complicated, and he knew the defense lawyers would try to confuse him. Officer Thompson arrived at the courthouse 30 minutes later. He parked his police car in the special spot reserved for officers and walked to the employee entrance. But when he got there, he saw a sign that said the entrance was closed for repairs. He would have to use the main entrance like everyone else. This made Thompson angry. He did not like being treated like a regular person. He believed that police officers deserved special treatment. As he walked around to the front of the building, his mood got worse and worse. Inside the courthouse, more people were arriving for the trial. Some were family members of the accused officers. Others were reporters who wanted to write about the case. A few were just curious citizens who had heard about the corruption scandal. Judge Washington was driving through the city traffic, thinking about the day ahead. He knew that this case would be watched carefully by everyone. If he made any mistakes, people would criticize him. But he was confident in his abilities. He had handled difficult cases before, and he always tried to be fair. The judge decided to park in the public parking lot instead of his reserved spot. He wanted to walk through the main part of the courthouse and see how busy it was. Sometimes judges got isolated in their chambers and did not understand what was happening in the rest of the building. As he walked toward the courthouse, Judge Washington thought about justice. He believed that everyone deserved to be treated fairly by the law. It did not matter if you were rich or poor, black or white, police officer or criminal. Everyone had rights, and it was his job to protect those rights. The morning sun was getting brighter, and more people were arriving at the courthouse. Nobody knew that in just a few hours something would happen that would change everything. The three men, Detective Williams, Officer Thompson, and Judge Washington, were all getting ready for what they thought would be a normal day at court. But sometimes normal days turn into extraordinary ones in ways that nobody can predict. Judge Washington pulled into the public parking lot and found a space near the back. He grabbed his briefcase from the passenger seat and locked his car. The morning air was cool, and he enjoyed the short walk to the courthouse. He was wearing a simple blue shirt and dark pants, looking like any other professional heading to work. As he approached the courthouse, Judge Washington decided to enter through the main entrance instead of his usual private entrance. Construction workers had blocked off his normal route with orange cones and yellow tape. They were fixing some pipes, and the area smelled like wet concrete and paint. The main entrance was busy with people coming and going. Judge Washington joined the line at the security checkpoint, standing behind a young lawyer who was nervously shuffling through papers. The metal detectors beeped regularly as people emptied their pockets and walked through. Officer Thompson was standing near the security area, watching everyone who came through the door. His eyes moved from person to person, looking for anyone who seemed suspicious. When he saw Judge Washington in the line, something about him caught Thompson's attention. Thompson saw a well-dressed black man carrying a briefcase, but he did not recognize him. In Thompson's mind, black men who came to court were usually there because they were in trouble with the law. He did not think about the possibility that this man might be a lawyer, a witness, or even a judge. Judge Washington reached the metal detector and placed his briefcase on the conveyor belt. He emptied his pockets, putting his keys, wallet, and phone in the plastic tray. The security guard running the machine was someone Judge Washington had seen many times before. But today the guard was busy talking to another worker and did not look up. As Judge Washington walked through the metal detector, Officer Thompson stepped forward. His voice was loud and unfriendly when he spoke. "Hold on there," Thompson said, pointing at Judge Washington. "Where do you think you're going?" Judge Washington stopped and turned around, surprised by the officer's tone. He had been coming to this courthouse for 20 years and no one had ever spoken to him like that. "I work here," Judge Washington said calmly. "I need to get to my office." Thompson looked Judge Washington up and down, his eyes full of suspicion. "Work here doing what? Cleaning floors?" The question was insulting, but Judge Washington kept his voice steady. "No, I am a judge in this courthouse," Thompson laughed, but it was not a friendly laugh. "Right, and I'm the President of the United States. You got some ID?" Judge Washington reached into his wallet and pulled out his courthouse identification card. It had his photo and his title, Chief Judge David Washington. He handed the card to Officer Thompson. Thompson barely looked at the ID before handing it back. "This looks fake to me. Anyone can make one of these on a computer." "I assure you it is real," Judge Washington said, still trying to stay calm. "If you call the court administration office, they can confirm who I am." "I don't need to call anyone," Thompson said, his voice getting louder. "I can spot a fake ID from a mile away. What you need to do is tell me the real reason you're here. What crime did you commit? What charges are you facing?" Other people in the security line were starting to watch what was happening. Some looked uncomfortable, but no one said anything. A few people recognized Judge Washington, but they were too far away to help. Detective Marcus Williams was sitting in the lobby reading his notes when he heard the loud voices. He looked up and saw Officer Thompson talking aggressively to a black man in business clothes. Marcus could not hear exactly what was being said, but he could tell that the situation was getting tense. "Look, officer," Judge Washington said. "There seems to be some confusion here. I am Chief Judge David Washington, and I need to get to my chambers to prepare for court. Perhaps we can call your supervisor to clear this up." "My supervisor?" Thompson's face was getting red with anger. "You don't get to tell me what to do. You people always think you're better than everyone else. Well, let me tell you something. In this courthouse, I'm the one in charge of security." Judge Washington felt his patience being tested, but he had spent years learning how to control his emotions. As a judge, he often had to deal with difficult people, and he knew that losing his temper would only make things worse. "I understand you are doing your job," Judge Washington said, "but if you check with the court staff, they will tell you that I belong here." Thompson stepped closer, trying to use his size to intimidate the judge. The only place you belong is in the defendant's chair, waiting for your case to be called. Now stop lying to me and tell me what you really did. Several court employees were starting to notice what was happening. A secretary who had worked in the courthouse for 10 years recognized Judge Washington immediately. She started walking over to help, but she was on the other side of the large lobby and had to push through the crowd. Judge Washington realized that Officer Thompson was not going to listen to reason. The officer's mind was made up, and nothing the judge said was going to change it. Judge Washington had seen this kind of prejudice before, but it was shocking to experience it so directly. "Officer Thompson," Judge Washington said, reading the name tag on the man's uniform, "I'm going to report this incident to your superiors. Your behavior is completely inappropriate." "Report me?" Thompson laughed again. "Who's going to believe a criminal over a police officer? You must think I'm stupid." The secretary was getting closer, and she could now hear what was being said. She was horrified by Officer Thompson's behavior. She knew Judge Washington personally and had great respect for him. Marcus Williams stood up from his seat and started walking toward the security area. As a police officer himself, he knew that what he was seeing was wrong. Even if Thompson did not know who Judge Washington was, there was no excuse for treating anyone with such disrespect. Judge Washington looked around the lobby and saw people staring. Some looked embarrassed for him. Others seemed to enjoy seeing a well-dressed black man being humiliated. The judge felt a familiar sadness wash over him. After all these years, after all his accomplishments, some people still could not see past the color of his skin. "I'm going to ask you one more time," Thompson said, his voice full of threat. "What are you really here for? And don't give me any more lies about being a judge." Judge Washington straightened his shoulders and looked Thompson directly in the eyes. "I am Chief Judge David Washington, and I will be presiding over court this morning. That is the truth, whether you choose to believe it or not." Thompson's face twisted with anger. In his mind, this black man was challenging his authority, and that was something he would never allow. Officer Thompson's face was now bright red with anger. He could not believe that this black man was continuing to lie to him. In Thompson's mind, no black person could possibly be a judge, especially not the chief judge. He had worked in law enforcement for 12 years, and he thought he knew how the world worked. "You're really going to stand there and keep lying to me?" Thompson said, his voice getting louder. "Do you think I'm some kind of fool?" Judge Washington remained calm, but inside he was feeling a mix of anger and sadness. He had worked his whole life to get where he was. He had gone to law school, worked as a prosecutor, and then as a defense attorney before becoming a judge. He had earned his position through hard work and dedication, not because of any special treatment. "I am not lying to you," Judge Washington said firmly. "I have shown you my identification and I have told you who I am. What more do you want from me?" "What I want," Thompson said, stepping even closer, "is for you to stop playing games and tell me the truth. You probably have a long criminal record, and now you're trying to trick your way into the courthouse. Well, it's not going to work." People in the lobby were starting to gather around to watch what was happening. Some were pulling out their phones to record the scene. Others were whispering to each other, trying to figure out what was going on. Detective Marcus Williams was now close enough to hear everything that was being said. He recognized Judge Washington from previous cases where he had testified. Marcus knew that the man being harassed was indeed the chief judge, and he was shocked by Officer Thompson's behavior. The court secretary who had been trying to reach them was almost there, but she kept getting blocked by the crowd of people who were watching the confrontation. "Officer," Judge Washington said, trying once more to reason with Thompson, "you are making a serious mistake. I suggest you call your supervisor right now before this situation gets any worse." "The only mistake here," Thompson replied, "is you thinking you can fool me. I've been doing this job for a long time and I know a criminal when I see one. You people always think you can talk your way out of trouble." The phrase "you people" hit Judge Washington like a slap in the face. He had heard those words many times throughout his life, always said with the same tone of disgust and hatred. It was a phrase that reduced him from an individual human being to just another member of a group that Thompson despised. "Excuse me, officer," said a voice from behind them. It was the court secretary, who had finally made her way through the crowd. "There seems to be some confusion here." Thompson turned around and saw a middle-aged white woman in a business suit. "Ma'am, please step back." I'm handling a security situation here. But officer, you don't understand, she started to say. I said step back. Thompson shouted. This is police business and I don't need any civilians getting involved. The secretary looked at Judge Washington with an expression of sympathy and frustration. She wanted to help, but Thompson's aggressive behavior was making it difficult for her to explain who the judge really was. Judge Washington gave the secretary a small nod, silently telling her that it was okay. He had been in difficult situations before, and he knew how to handle himself. But he also knew that this situation was quickly spinning out of control. Listen to me very carefully, Thompson said, turning back to Judge Washington. I'm going to give you one last chance to tell me the truth. What crime are you here for? Are you a defendant or a witness? And don't even think about lying to me again. I have told you the truth from the beginning, Judge Washington replied. I am Chief Judge David Washington, and I need to get to my chambers to prepare for court. Thompson shook his head in disgust. You just don't learn, do you? You think if you keep repeating the same lie, I'm going to start believing it. Well, here's some news for you. I wasn't born yesterday. Marcus Williams decided he had heard enough. As a fellow police officer, he felt he had to say something. He walked over to where Thompson was standing. Hey, Thompson, Marcus said. Maybe you should take it easy on this gentleman. Thompson spun around to face Marcus. Williams, what are you doing here? I'm here to testify in the corruption case, Marcus replied. And I think you're making a big mistake here. Mistake? Thompson laughed. The only mistake is this guy thinking he can lie his way past security. He claims he's a judge. Can you believe that? Marcus looked at Judge Washington and then back at Thompson. He knew he should tell Thompson who the man really was, but he was curious to see how far Thompson would go with his racist behavior. Maybe you should check with someone upstairs, Marcus suggested. Just to be sure. I don't need to check with anyone, Thompson said angrily. I know how to do my job. This guy's obviously lying, and I'm not going to let him make a fool out of me. Judge Washington was watching this exchange with interest. He could see that Detective Williams knew who he was, but the detective was not saying anything. Judge Washington understood why. Sometimes it was important to let people show their true character. Look, officer, Judge Washington said. I can see that you are not going to believe me no matter what I say, but I need to get to my office. The court day is about to begin, and I have responsibilities. Your only responsibility, Thompson said, pointing his finger at the judge, is to sit down and wait until your case is called. And if you keep giving me attitude, I might have to arrest you for disorderly conduct. The threat of arrest hung in the air like a dark cloud. Everyone in the lobby could feel the tension rising. People were starting to take out their phones to record what was happening. They sensed that something important was taking place. Judge Washington felt a chill run down his spine. He realized that Thompson was serious about arresting him. This police officer was so blinded by his prejudice that he was willing to arrest a judge for trying to go to work. You want to arrest me for disorderly conduct? Judge Washington asked calmly. What exactly have I done that is disorderly? You've been lying to a police officer and refusing to follow orders, Thompson replied. That's disorderly conduct in my book. I see, Judge Washington said. And what orders have I refused to follow? Thompson was getting more frustrated by the minute. This black man was too calm, too educated, too confident. It made Thompson feel unsure of himself, and that made him even angrier. I told you to tell me the truth about why you're here, Thompson said. Instead, you keep telling me this ridiculous story about being a judge. So now I'm ordering you to sit down over there with the other defendants and wait for your case to be called. Judge Washington looked over at the seating area where people accused of crimes had to wait. The idea of sitting there being treated like a criminal was deeply humiliating. But he also knew that resisting would only make things worse. And if I refuse? Judge Washington asked quietly. Thompson smiled, but it was not a kind smile. Then you'll find out what happens to people who don't respect the law. The courthouse lobby had become very quiet. People were standing around watching the confrontation between Officer Thompson and Judge Washington. Many of them had their phones out recording what was happening. The tension in the air was so thick you could almost touch it. Judge Washington looked at the seating area where Thompson wanted him to sit. It was a row of hard plastic chairs where people who were accused of crimes had to wait for their cases to be called. The judge had seen thousands of people sit in those chairs over the years, but he had never imagined that he might be forced to sit there himself. "I am going to ask you one more time," Judge Washington said, his voice still calm but firm. "Please contact your supervisor or someone from court administration. They will confirm who I am, and we can end this misunderstanding." Thompson shook his head and laughed bitterly. "There's no misunderstanding here. The only thing I don't understand is why you keep lying to me. Do you really think you're smarter than a police officer?" "This has nothing to do with intelligence," Judge Washington replied. "This is about respect and basic human dignity." "Respect?" Thompson's voice rose to almost a shout. "You want respect? Then you should have thought about that before you decided to break the law. Criminals don't get respect in my courthouse." Detective Marcus Williams was still standing nearby, watching everything unfold. He felt sick to his stomach as he listened to Thompson's words. Marcus knew that he should step in and stop this, but part of him wanted to see exactly how far Thompson would go. This would be important evidence if Thompson ever faced disciplinary action. The court secretary was also still there, looking desperate to help, but not knowing what to do. She had tried to interrupt earlier, but Thompson had yelled at her to stay back. Now she was afraid that if she said anything else, Thompson might turn his anger on her too. Judge Washington took a deep breath and made a decision. He was not going to sit in the defendant's seating area. He had done nothing wrong, and he would not allow himself to be treated like a criminal. He picked up his briefcase and started to walk toward the hallway that led to the judicial chambers. "Where do you think you're going?" Thompson demanded, quickly moving to block the judge's path. "I am going to my office," Judge Washington said calmly. "I have work to do." Thompson stepped directly in front of Judge Washington, so close that their faces were only inches apart. The officer's face was red with rage, and small drops of spit flew from his mouth as he spoke. "You're not going anywhere except to those chairs over there. I'm not going to let some criminal walk around my courthouse like he owns the place. Please move out of my way," Judge Washington said, his voice still controlled but showing the first signs of strain. "Make me," Thompson said with a nasty smile. Judge Washington tried to step around the officer, but Thompson moved to block him again. The judge tried to go the other way, but Thompson was ready for that too. It was like a cruel game, with Thompson enjoying his power to control another human being. "This is harassment, officer," Judge Washington said. "You have no legal right to detain me." "I have every right to detain suspicious people," Thompson replied. "And you're about as suspicious as they come." Judge Washington realized that he was trapped. If he tried to push past Thompson, the officer could claim that he was being attacked. If he stayed where he was, he would be late for court, and dozens of people would be affected. Either way, Thompson would win. "I'm going to count to 3, Thompson said, pointing toward the defendant's seating area. "If you're not moving toward those chairs by the time I get to 3, I'm going to arrest you right here in front of everyone." The crowd of people watching held their breath. Judge Washington stood perfectly still, his dignity intact despite the humiliation he was facing. He was thinking about all the times throughout history when people had been treated badly because of the color of their skin. He thought about his grandfather, who had been denied the right to vote. He thought about his father, who had been refused service at restaurants, and now here he was, a chief judge, being threatened with arrest for trying to go to work. 1, Thompson said loudly. Judge Washington did not move. 2, still. The judge remained where he was, his back straight and his head held high. Thompson was expecting Judge Washington to give in and walk to the chairs. When the judge didn't move, Thompson felt his authority being challenged in front of all these people. He could not let that happen. In his mind, this black man was making him look weak, and that was something he would never allow. 3, Thompson said, and then, without any warning, he raised his hand and slapped Judge Washington hard across the face. The sound of the slap echoed through the courthouse lobby like a gunshot. For a moment, nobody moved. Nobody spoke. The only sound was the ringing echo of Thompson's hand hitting the judge's face. Judge Washington's head snapped to the side from the force of the blow. A red mark immediately appeared on his cheek where Thompson had hit him. But the judge did not cry out. He did not fall down. He did not fight back. Instead, he slowly turned his head back to face Thompson, his eyes blazing with controlled anger. The crowd of people watching gasped in shock. Several people screamed. Someone dropped their phone and it clattered on the marble floor. Detective Marcus Williams reached for his own phone and started recording. Thompson looked around at all the people staring at him. For just a moment, he wondered if he had gone too far, But then he saw the look of shock and fear on their faces and he felt powerful again. This is what happened to people who didn't show him respect. Now, Thompson said, his voice full of satisfaction. Are you ready to cooperate? Judge Washington touched his cheek where he had been struck. He could feel it swelling already. In all his years as a judge, he had never been treated with such disrespect. But he also knew that how he responded to this moment would be remembered for the rest of his life. You have just assaulted a judge, he said quietly, but his voice carried clearly through the silent lobby. You will face the consequences of your actions. Thompson laughed, but it sounded forced and nervous. Right, a judge. And I'm the Pope. You're going to face the consequences if you don't start doing what I tell you. The court secretary finally found her courage. Officer Thompson, she said loudly. That man is Chief Judge David Washington. Thompson spun around to face her. Lady, I already told you to stay out of this. But you don't understand, she said desperately. He really is the chief judge. I've worked here for 10 years and I know who he is. Some other court employees were starting to arrive for work, and they could see the crowd gathered in the lobby. A few of them recognized Judge Washington and started pushing through the crowd to help. Thompson looked around nervously. These people seemed to really believe that this black man was a judge. But that was impossible. In Thompson's world, judges were white men in expensive suits. They were not black men who looked like they belonged in handcuffs. Judge Washington picked up his briefcase, which he had dropped when Thompson hit him. His face was calm, but his eyes showed the depth of his anger and determination. You have made the biggest mistake of your career, Officer Thompson, Judge Washington said, and very soon, everyone will know exactly what kind of man you really are. The courthouse lobby was in chaos. People were talking loudly, pointing at Officer Thompson and trying to get closer to see what was happening. Some were still recording with their phones, knowing they had just witnessed something that would be talked about for years to come. Several court employees who had just arrived for work pushed through the crowd. They could see Judge Washington standing there with a red mark on his face, and they immediately understood that something terrible had happened. Judge Washington called out Mrs. Patterson, the head court clerk. She had worked with the judge for over 15 years and respected him greatly. Are you all right? Thompson heard her use the word judge and felt a cold chill run down his spine. But he quickly pushed the feeling away. These people were probably just playing along with the lie. Maybe they were all friends and they were trying to help this criminal get away with something. Ma'am, Thompson said to Mrs. Patterson, please step back. This man is not a judge. He's obviously a defendant who's trying to trick his way into the courthouse. Mrs. Patterson looked at Thompson like he was crazy. Officer, this is Chief Judge David Washington. He has been the head judge of this courthouse for 10 years. What is wrong with you? More court employees were gathering around now. The bailiff, 2 more clerks, and a court reporter all recognized Judge Washington immediately. They were all talking at once, trying to explain to Thompson who the judge was, but Thompson was not listening. In his mind, this was all part of some elaborate trick. Maybe these people were criminals too, and they were all working together. It would not be the first time that criminals had tried to fool the police with fake stories. Detective Marcus Williams stepped forward, still recording with his phone. Thompson, he said quietly, I think you need to listen to what these people are telling you. Williams, not you too, Thompson said angrily. Can't you see what's happening here? They're all lying to protect this guy. It's probably some kind of gang thing. Marcus could not believe what he was hearing. Thompson was so blinded by his prejudice that he could not accept the truth even when it was right in front of him. Marcus had seen racism before, but this was worse than anything he had ever witnessed. Judge Washington raised his hand to quiet everyone down. Despite being the victim of an assault, he took control of the situation with the natural authority of someone used to managing difficult circumstances. Please, everyone, Judge Washington said calmly. I appreciate your concern, but I can handle this situation. He turned to face Officer Thompson directly. The red mark on his cheek was getting darker, and it would clearly be visible for days, but his voice remained steady and professional. Officer Thompson, Judge Washington said, you have just committed assault against a sitting judge. This is a serious federal crime, and you will face the full consequences of your actions. Thompson's face was still red with anger, but now there was something else there too. A small seed of doubt was starting to grow in his mind. All these people seemed to really know this man. They were calling him by name, and they all seemed genuinely shocked by what had happened. "I don't care what they call you," Thompson said, but his voice was not as confident as before. "Anyone can pay people to lie for them." Mrs. Patterson shook her head in disbelief. "Officer Thompson, I have Judge Washington's schedule right here in my folder. He is supposed to be presiding over the corruption case at 9 o'clock this morning. The case you are here to provide security for." Thompson felt like the ground was shifting under his feet. The corruption case was real, and he was indeed supposed to be providing security. But there was no way that this black man could be the judge for such an important case. "Let me see that," Thompson demanded, grabbing the folder from Mrs. Patterson's hands. He opened it and saw the official court schedule. At the top of the page it clearly said, "Presiding Judge, Chief Judge David Washington." Below that was a photo of Judge Washington in his judicial robes, looking exactly like the man standing in front of him. Thompson stared at the paper for a long moment. His hands were shaking slightly and sweat was starting to form on his forehead. The reality of what he had done was beginning to sink in. "This could be fake too," Thompson said weakly, but he no longer sounded convinced of his own words. Detective Williams walked over and looked at the schedule. "Thompson, that's an official court document. See the seal at the bottom? You can't fake that." Judge Washington watched as the truth slowly dawned on Officer Thompson's face. The judge felt no satisfaction in watching the officer's world crumble. Instead, he felt sad that prejudice could make a person so blind to reality. A young court reporter named Sarah had been watching everything from the edge of the crowd. She worked in Judge Washington's courtroom regularly and knew him well. She was so angry about what she had witnessed that she was almost crying. "Officer Thompson," Sarah said, her voice shaking with emotion. "Judge Washington is one of the most respected judges in the state. He has been fair to everyone who comes before his court, including police officers. How could you treat him like this?" Thompson looked around at all the faces staring at him. For the first time, he began to realize that maybe, just maybe, he had made a terrible mistake. But his pride would not let him admit it. He had built his entire identity around being tough and never backing down. "Even if he is a judge," Thompson said stubbornly, "he should have identified himself properly. He should have demanded to see my supervisor instead of arguing with me." Judge Washington almost smiled at this. "Officer Thompson, I showed you my identification. I asked you 3 times to call your supervisor. I explained who I was repeatedly. You chose not to believe me." The bailiff who worked in Judge Washington's courtroom stepped forward. His name was Officer Rodriguez, and he had great respect for the judge. "Thompson, what is wrong with you?" Rodriguez asked. "Judge Washington has been coming through this courthouse for 20 years. How do you not know who he is?" Thompson was running out of arguments. Deep down, he was starting to accept that this really was a judge. But accepting that would mean accepting that he had just assaulted one of the most important people in the courthouse. It would mean his career was over. It would mean he was going to prison. Just then, a voice came over the courthouse public address system. "All rise. Court will be in session in 15 minutes. Judge Washington to the bench. Judge Washington to the bench." The announcement echoed through the lobby, and everyone turned to look at Judge Washington. Thompson's face went completely white. He looked like he might be sick. Judge Washington picked up his briefcase and started walking toward the judicial chambers. As he passed Officer Thompson, he stopped and looked the officer in the eyes. "You had a choice this morning," Judge Washington said quietly, so only Thompson could hear. "You could have treated me with basic human respect. Instead, you chose to see me as nothing more than the color of my skin. Now you will learn that actions have consequences." Thompson opened his mouth to say something, but no words came out. He watched as Judge Washington walked away with dignity and tact, despite everything that had happened. Detective Marcus Williams put his phone away and walked over to Thompson. "You know what the worst part of this is?" Marcus asked. "Judge Washington is actually one of the good ones. He's fair to cops. He understands that we have a tough job. But after today, I doubt he'll ever look at a police officer the same way again." Thompson stood there in the middle of the lobby, surrounded by people who were staring at him with disgust and disbelief. He realized that his life was about to change forever, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. Judge Washington walked through the courthouse hallways toward his chambers. Court employees and lawyers who saw him were shocked by the red mark on his face. But he nodded politely to each of them, as if nothing had happened. His years of experience as a judge had taught him how to maintain his composure, even in the most difficult situations. When he reached his chambers, Judge Washington closed the door behind him and sat down at his desk. For the first time since the incident began, he allowed himself a moment to feel the full impact of what had just happened. He had been publicly humiliated, physically assaulted, and treated like a criminal, all because of the color of his skin. Judge Washington looked at himself in the small mirror on his desk. The mark on his cheek was getting darker, and it would clearly be visible when he took the bench. Everyone in the courtroom would see it and wonder what had happened. But he would not let Officer Thompson's actions prevent him from doing his job. He opened his closet and took out his black judicial robes. As he put them on, he thought about what they represented. These robes were a symbol of justice, fairness, and the rule of law. They meant that in his courtroom everyone was supposed to be treated equally, regardless of their race, religion, or social status. Meanwhile, back in the lobby, Officer Thompson was standing alone. Most of the crowd had dispersed, but a few court employees were still there, looking at him with expressions of disgust and disbelief. The weight of what he had done was finally starting to sink in. Detective Marcus Williams approached Thompson one more time. "You know, Thompson, I've been a cop for 15 years, and I've never seen anything like what you just did. You assaulted a judge because you couldn't believe that a black man could hold that position." Thompson's hands were shaking now. I didn't know," he said weakly. "You didn't know because you didn't want to know," Marcus replied. "He showed you his ID. He told you who he was. Other people tried to explain it to you. But you were so convinced that you were right, you couldn't see the truth." Thompson looked around the lobby. A few people were still recording with their phones, and he knew that videos of what had happened would soon be all over the internet. His name would be known throughout the country as the racist cop who slapped a judge. Mrs. Patterson, the head court clerk, walked over to Thompson. "Officer, you need to report to your supervisor immediately. This incident will have to be documented and investigated." Thompson nodded but did not move. He felt like his legs were made of lead. Everything he had worked for in his 12-year career was about to be destroyed because of one moment of blind prejudice. In his chambers, Judge Washington was reviewing the files for the corruption case. Despite everything that had happened, he was determined to give the case his full attention. 3 police officers were accused of taking bribes, and their fate would be decided in his courtroom. The irony was not lost on him that he would be judging police misconduct just minutes after being assaulted by a police officer himself. There was a knock on Judge Washington's door. "Come in," he called. Mrs. Patterson entered, looking very concerned. "Judge Washington, are you all right? Should we postpone the trial?" Judge Washington shook his head.
"No, Mrs. Patterson. Justice cannot wait because one man chose to act foolishly."
"We will proceed as scheduled. But, sir, your face, everyone will see. Let them see," Judge Washington said firmly. "Let them see what prejudice looks like. Maybe it will remind them why we have courts in the first place." Mrs. Patterson nodded, understanding the judge's determination to turn this negative experience into a teaching moment. At exactly 9:02 a.m., the bailiff called the courtroom to order. "All rise. The Honorable Judge David Washington presiding." The courtroom was packed with lawyers, defendants, family members, reporters, and curious observers. As Judge Washington entered and took his place behind the bench, a murmur went through the crowd. Everyone could see the dark red mark on his cheek. Officer Thompson was supposed to be providing security for the trial, but he was standing in the back of the courtroom, trying to make himself invisible. When he saw Judge Washington in his robes, sitting behind the bench with the seal of the court behind him, Thompson felt like he might collapse. Judge Washington looked out at the packed courtroom. His eyes briefly met those of Officer Thompson, and Thompson had to look away. The judge's expression was calm and professional, but Thompson could see the intelligence and dignity that he had been too blind to recognize earlier. "Ladies and gentlemen," Judge Washington began, his voice carrying clearly through the courtroom, "we are here today to ensure that justice is served fairly and impartially. In this courtroom, every person will be treated with respect and dignity, regardless of their position, their race, or their background." As he spoke these words, Judge Washington's eyes moved to Officer Thompson again. This time Thompson forced himself to maintain eye contact, and he could see that the judge was speaking directly to him. "The law is blind to everything except the truth," Judge Washington continued. It does not see color. It does not see wealth or poverty. It sees only right and wrong, justice and injustice. Detective Marcus Williams was sitting in the witness section, still amazed by Judge Washington's professionalism. Despite being assaulted just an hour earlier, the judge was conducting the trial as if nothing had happened. Marcus had even more respect for Judge Washington now than he had before. Judge Washington called the court to order and began reviewing the charges against the 3 police officers accused of corruption. As he read each charge, his voice remained steady and authoritative. But everyone in the courtroom was acutely aware of the mark on his face and what it represented. During the first recess, Judge Washington did not leave the bench immediately as he usually did. Instead, he looked directly at Officer Thompson, who was still standing at the back of the courtroom. "Officer Thompson," Judge Washington said, his voice carrying across the quiet courtroom, "please approach the bench." Thompson's legs felt like rubber as he walked down the aisle toward the judge's bench. Every eye in the courtroom was on him, and he could feel the weight of their stares. When he reached the front, he had to look up at Judge Washington, who now sat in the position of ultimate authority. "Officer Thompson," Judge Washington said calmly, "earlier this morning, you physically assaulted me in the courthouse lobby. You did this because you refused to believe that a black man could be a judge. Is that correct?" Thompson's mouth was dry and he could barely speak. "Yes, sir," he whispered. "You showed a complete disregard for my civil rights, my dignity, and the law itself. You let your prejudices cloud your judgment so completely that you committed a federal crime. Do you understand the seriousness of what you have done?" "Yes, sir," Thompson repeated, his voice shaking. Judge Washington looked at Thompson for a long moment. The entire courtroom was silent, waiting to see what would happen next. "Officer Thompson," Judge Washington said finally, "you are under arrest for assault on a federal judge, violation of civil rights, and obstruction of justice." The words hit Thompson like a physical blow. He had known this moment was coming, but hearing it officially pronounced made it real. His career was over. His life as he knew it was over. Judge Washington nodded to the court bailiff. "Officer Rodriguez, please take Officer Thompson into custody." As the handcuffs clicked around Thompson's wrists, he looked up at Judge Washington one more time. The judge's expression was not angry or vengeful. Instead, it was sad, as if he felt sorry for Thompson and the choices that had led to this moment. "The court will take a 30-minute recess," Judge Washington announced. "We will reconvene to continue with the scheduled trial." As Thompson was led away in handcuffs, the irony of the situation was clear to everyone in the courtroom. In a trial about police corruption, another police officer was being arrested for his own misconduct right in front of everyone. The courtroom buzzed with whispered conversations as Officer Thompson was led away in handcuffs. Reporters were frantically typing on their phones and laptops, knowing they had just witnessed something that would make headlines across the country. The image of a racist police officer being arrested by the very judge he had assaulted would be front-page news. Judge Washington remained on the bench, watching as Thompson was taken through the side door that led to the courthouse jail. Even though justice was being served, the judge felt no satisfaction. He had seen too much hatred and prejudice in his life to take pleasure in anyone's downfall, even someone who had wronged him so deeply. Detective Marcus Williams sat in the witness section, shaking his head in disbelief. He had recorded everything on his phone, from the initial confrontation in the lobby to Thompson's arrest in the courtroom. The video would serve as crucial evidence in the criminal case that would surely follow. Mrs. Patterson, the head court clerk, approached the bench. "Your Honor, should we contact the FBI? Assault on a federal judge is within their jurisdiction." Judge Washington nodded. "Yes, please make the call. Also, contact Officer Thompson's supervisor and inform them of what has occurred. This incident will need to be thoroughly investigated." As the 30-minute recess continued, word of what had happened spread throughout the courthouse and beyond. Court employees were calling their friends and family members, telling them about the incredible scene they had witnessed. Social media posts were already appearing, with people sharing videos and photos of the incident. In the courthouse holding cell, Officer Thompson sat on a hard metal bench, staring at the floor. The reality of his situation was slowly sinking in. He had thrown away his career, his reputation, and possibly his freedom because he could not accept that a black man could be in a position of authority. Thompson thought about his wife and children at home. They would soon hear about what he had done and they would be ashamed of him. His fellow police officers would turn against him. His name would be forever associated with racism and stupidity. Meanwhile, Judge Washington was in his chambers, speaking on the phone with FBI agents who were already on their way to the courthouse. He described the incident in detail, his voice remaining calm and professional despite the personal nature of the attack. "Agent Morrison," Judge Washington said, "I want to make sure this investigation is thorough and fair. Officer Thompson's actions were inexcusable, but I believe in due process for everyone, including those who have wronged me." The FBI agent was impressed by the judge's fairness. Even after being assaulted, Judge Washington was more concerned with justice than revenge. When court reconvened, Judge Washington addressed the packed courtroom. The mark on his cheek had darkened even more, serving as a visible reminder of the morning's events. "Ladies and gentlemen," the judge began, "what you witnessed here today was an unfortunate example of how prejudice can corrupt judgment and lead to serious consequences. Officer Thompson allowed his biases to override his training, his common sense, and his respect for the law." He paused, looking around the courtroom at the faces watching him intently. "However, we are not here to dwell on one man's failures. We are here to ensure that justice is served in the case before us. The defendants in this corruption trial deserve a fair hearing, regardless of what else has happened today." Judge Washington's ability to separate his personal experience from his judicial duties impressed everyone in the courtroom. Even the defense lawyers, who had been worried that the judge might be biased against police officers after the assault, could see that he was determined to be fair. The trial proceeded with Judge Washington maintaining his usual high standards of professionalism. When Detective Marcus Williams was called to testify about the police corruption case, he spoke clearly and honestly about what he had discovered. His testimony helped to convict the 3 corrupt officers, sending a message that bad cops would be held accountable for their actions. During a lunch break, reporters gathered outside the courthouse, eager to interview anyone who had witnessed the morning's events. Mrs. Patterson spoke to the press, describing Judge Washington's dignity and professionalism in the face of such disrespectful treatment. Judge Washington could have let his anger take over, Mrs. Patterson told the reporters. "Instead, he showed us what true leadership looks like. He turned a moment of hatred into a lesson about justice and equality." Detective Williams also spoke to the reporters. "What I saw today was the difference between a good man and a bad man. Judge Washington represents everything that is right about our justice system. Officer Thompson represents everything that is wrong with prejudice and abuse of power." By the end of the day, the story had spread across the nation. News channels were showing the video of Thompson slapping Judge Washington, followed by footage of Thompson being arrested. Social media was filled with outrage over Thompson's actions and praise for Judge Washington's handling of the situation. In his home that evening, Judge Washington sat with his wife, telling her about the day's events. She was horrified by what had happened but proud of how her husband had responded. "David," she said, "you could have lost your temper. You could have fought back. Instead, you showed that man exactly who you are and what you stand for." Judge Washington touched the bruise on his cheek. "Violence only creates more violence," he said. "The best way to fight hatred is with dignity and justice." Meanwhile, Officer Thompson was sitting in a jail cell, awaiting his first court appearance. His lawyer had already told him that the evidence against him was overwhelming. The video footage, the witness testimony, and his own admission in court made his guilt undeniable. Thompson's police department had already announced that he was suspended without pay, pending the outcome of his criminal trial. His fellow officers were distancing themselves from him, not wanting to be associated with his racist behavior. The FBI investigation was swift and thorough. Within a week, federal charges were filed against Thompson for violating Judge Washington's civil rights under color of law, assault on a federal judge, and obstruction of justice. Each charge carried the possibility of years in prison. Judge Washington's response to the assault became a model for how to handle prejudice with grace and strength. Law schools began using the incident as a case study in judicial temperament and ethical behavior. Police academies used Thompson's story as an example of how bias could destroy a career and harm innocent people. The corruption trial that had been the original reason for everyone being in court that day was completed successfully. The 3 corrupt police officers were convicted and sentenced to prison terms. Judge Washington's fair handling of their case, despite his own negative experience with a police officer that same day, was praised by legal experts as an example of true judicial impartiality. Officer Thompson eventually pleaded guilty to all charges against him. At his sentencing hearing, he stood before a different judge and apologized for his actions, but his words seemed hollow and too late. He was sentenced to 3 years in federal prison and a lifetime ban from working in law enforcement. Judge Washington attended Thompson's sentencing hearing, not out of vindictiveness but because he believed in the importance of seeing justice through to its conclusion. When asked by reporters if he felt Thompson's sentence was appropriate, the judge simply said, "Justice has been served." The incident changed many things. Police departments across the country implemented new training programs about implicit bias and respectful treatment of all citizens. Courthouse security procedures were reviewed and improved, and Judge Washington became a symbol of dignity, professionalism, and the power of responding to hatred with justice rather than revenge. But perhaps most importantly, the incident served as a reminder that prejudice still existed in American society, and that it would take continued vigilance and education to overcome it. Judge Washington hoped that his experience would help others understand the importance of treating every person with respect and dignity, regardless of the color of their skin. 6 months after the incident at the courthouse, the story of Officer Thompson's assault on Judge Washington had become one of the most discussed cases of police misconduct in recent memory. The video that Detective Marcus Williams had recorded had been viewed millions of times online, sparking conversations about racism, police behavior, and the importance of treating everyone with dignity and respect. Judge Washington continued his work at the courthouse, but the incident had changed him in ways that were both subtle and profound. The red mark on his cheek had long since faded, but the memory of that morning remained fresh in his mind. He found himself paying closer attention to how people were treated in his courthouse, making sure that everyone who entered was shown proper respect. The judge had received thousands of letters and emails from people around the world who had heard about his story. Many came from other judges, lawyers, and law enforcement officers who praised his handling of the situation. Others came from ordinary citizens who were inspired by his dignity and professionalism in the face of such disrespect. One letter that particularly touched Judge Washington came from a young black law student who wrote, "Your example showed me that it is possible to face hatred with grace and strength. You didn't let Officer Thompson's ignorance change who you are or compromise your principles. That gives me hope for my own future in the legal profession." Officer Thompson, meanwhile, was serving his 3-year federal prison sentence. The man who had once felt so powerful and superior was now just another inmate in the system he had once worked for. His wife had divorced him, taking their children and moving to another state. His former colleagues in the police department rarely mentioned his name, except as an example of what not to do. In prison, Thompson had time to think about his actions and the beliefs that had led him to that moment in the courthouse lobby. He attended counseling sessions about bias and prejudice, slowly beginning to understand how his upbringing and experiences had shaped his racist attitudes. The process was difficult and painful, forcing him to confront parts of himself he had never wanted to examine. Detective Marcus Williams had been promoted to sergeant, partly because of his courage in documenting Thompson's misconduct. He often spoke to other police officers about the importance of holding each other accountable and treating all citizens with respect. What happened that day, Marcus would tell new recruits, shows us what can happen when we let our biases control our actions. Officer Thompson destroyed his life and hurt an innocent man because he couldn't see past the color of someone's skin. We have to be better than that. The police department where Thompson had worked underwent major reforms after the incident. New training programs were implemented to help officers recognize and overcome their own biases. Supervisors were taught to take complaints about officer misconduct more seriously. The department also established a citizen review board to provide oversight of police actions. Chief of Police Robert Martinez, who had been Thompson's ultimate supervisor, held a press conference to address the incident and announce the reforms. Officer Thompson's actions do not represent the values of this department or the vast majority of officers who serve with honor and integrity, Chief Martinez said. However, we cannot ignore the fact that his behavior went unchecked for too long. We failed to address the warning signs, and we must do better. The courthouse where the incident occurred also made changes. Security procedures were updated to ensure that all visitors, regardless of their appearance, were treated with courtesy and respect. Training programs were implemented for all courthouse personnel, emphasizing the importance of dignity and professionalism. Mrs. Patterson, the head court clerk, was put in charge of the new training program. She often used the story of Judge Washington and Officer Thompson to illustrate her points about respect and proper behavior. Judge Washington showed us that day what real strength looks like. Mrs. Patterson would tell new employees, he could have responded with anger or violence, but instead he chose to respond with dignity and justice. That's the standard we should all aspire to. The incident also had a broader impact on American society. It became a case study in law schools, teaching future lawyers about judicial temperament and the importance of treating everyone fairly. Police academies used Thompson's story as an example of how prejudice could destroy a career and harm innocent people. Civil rights organizations pointed to the case as evidence that racism still existed in American institutions and that constant vigilance was needed to combat it. They praised Judge Washington's response while noting that not everyone who faced such treatment had the power and position to demand justice. Judge Washington himself became a sought-after speaker at legal conferences and civil rights events. He used these opportunities to talk about the importance of treating everyone with dignity and respect, regardless of their race, background, or circumstances. What happened to me that day, Judge Washington would tell his audiences, happens to people every day in this country. The only difference is that I had the power to demand accountability. We must work to ensure that everyone has that same protection under the law. The judge also established a scholarship fund for minority law students, using some of the money from a settlement with the police department to help young people pursue careers in law. He wanted to ensure that the legal profession continued to become more diverse and representative of the communities it served. 1 year after the incident, Judge Washington was honored with a prestigious award from the American Bar Association for his commitment to justice and equality. In his acceptance speech, he reflected on the lessons learned from that difficult day. I have spent my career trying to ensure that justice is blind to everything except the truth, Judge Washington said. What I learned that day is that while the law may be blind, the people who enforce and interpret it are not. We all carry biases and assumptions that can cloud our judgment. The key is to recognize these biases and work to overcome them. He continued, Officer Thompson's actions that day were wrong and inexcusable, but they also provided an opportunity for learning and growth. They reminded us all that the fight for equality and justice is not over, and that each of us has a role to play in that fight. Officer Thompson, watching the speech on television from his prison cell, felt a mixture of shame and respect for the man he had wronged. He had written several letters of apology to Judge Washington, but had never sent them, feeling that his words were inadequate to express his regret. As Thompson's release date approached, he wondered what he would do with the rest of his life. His law enforcement career was over, and his reputation was permanently damaged. But he had used his time in prison to educate himself about racism and prejudice, and he hoped to find a way to make amends for his actions. Judge Washington, for his part, had forgiven Officer Thompson, though he had never communicated this directly to him. The judge believed that forgiveness was essential for healing, both for the victim and the perpetrator. But forgiveness did not mean forgetting or failing to hold people accountable for their actions. The story of that day at the courthouse continued to resonate with people around the world. It served as a reminder that prejudice could manifest itself in unexpected ways and in unexpected places. But it also showed that dignity, professionalism, and a commitment to justice could triumph over hatred and ignorance. Judge Washington continued his distinguished career, knowing that his response to that moment of crisis had become part of his legacy. He had shown that true strength came not from fighting back against hatred, but from responding to it with grace, wisdom, and an unwavering commitment to justice. The incident had changed everyone involved, in different ways and to different degrees. For Judge Washington, it reinforced his belief in the importance of treating everyone fairly. For Detective Williams, it strengthened his commitment to holding bad officers accountable. For Mrs. Patterson and the other court employees, it provided a powerful example of leadership under pressure. And for Officer Thompson, serving his sentence in federal prison. It was a harsh but necessary lesson about the consequences of letting prejudice override judgment, compassion, and basic human decency. His story served as a warning to others, but also as proof that even in the darkest moments, there was always a chance for redemption and growth. The courthouse where it all began displayed a small plaque near the main entrance, donated by the local bar association. It read, "Justice is truth in action. Let all who enter here be treated with dignity and respect, regardless of their race, religion, or station in life." Every day, as Judge Washington walked past that plaque on his way to work, he was reminded of the importance of the work he did and the responsibility he carried. The incident with Officer Thompson had been painful and humiliating, but it had also reinforced his commitment to ensuring that justice truly was blind to everything except the truth.